Just like to get everyone's attention. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai roi lo echsar, vinodeh sheyarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yenahaleni, nafshi yeshovev, yancheni b'magelei tzedek, למען שמו, גם כי אלך בגיא צל מוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי, שבטך ומשענתך, המה ינחמוני, תערוך לפניי, שולחן נגד צורריי, דשנת בשמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה, אך טוב החסד, ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית אדוני, לאורך ימים. O Lord, what is man that you should regard him? Man is like a breath. His days are like a passing shadow. They are like a dream, like grass which is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes, in the evening it fades and withers. The years of our life are few. Their pride is but toil. They are soon gone and we fly away. So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Guard the innocent and behold the upright, for there is posterity for the man of peace. Surely God will redeem my soul. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. The dust returns to the earth as it was, but the spirit returns to God who gave it. It's with great sadness that we're all gathered today to bid farewell to a very special human being, Dr. Albert Rosenberg. In a few moments, we'll hear from members of the family about his remarkable life. On a personal note, I feel very privileged to have known Dr. Rosenberg. And I want to tell you something about every time that Dr. Rosenberg greeted me. He greeted me with two words. Hello, Rabbi. Two words that I've heard thousands of times from thousands of people. And yet, when Dr. Rosenberg said those two words, it felt different. He said them with such sincerity and with such warmth. He said them with such honesty and with so much enthusiasm. They were always accompanied with a smile. His hello, Rabbi, was very, very special. Dr. Rosenberg was always kind to me, and he always had a kind word for me, as he did for everyone. And I will always remember that. This coming Shabbat, tomorrow, we will read in synagogue Parshat Chukat. And our rabbis teach us that there are no coincidences in the world. And as we read Parshat Chukat tomorrow, we will read about the passing of another great Jew, Aharon HaKohen, Aaron the high priest. And I thought to myself, this is not a coincidence that Dr. Rosenberg has passed on the same week. Our rabbis made a very interesting comparison, and they compared the death of Aharon, the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, to that of Moses, the great leader. And this is what it says about Aharon. Vayiru kol ha'eda ki gava Aharon. And the entire nation saw that Aharon had expired. Vayifku et Aharon shloshim yom. And they cried for Aharon for 30 days, Kol Beit Yisrael, the entire, all of the Jewish people. And what does it say about Moses? Vayifku b'nei Yisrael et Moshe. And the Jewish people also cried for Moses, Be'arvot Moav Shloshim Yom, for 30 days. And the rabbis tell us that there's one word missing by Moses, and that is Kol. All of the Jewish people. For Aharon, all of the Jewish people cried. By Moses, just the children of Israel, the sons. And our rabbis conclude that Aharon, the high priest, was more beloved even than Moses. And why would this be so? Why was Aharon so beloved? And they tell us, because he was a man of peace, an Ohev Shalom, one who loved peace, a Rodev Shalom, one who pursued peace, Ohev et Habriot, he loved every human being, Umekarvan la Torah, and he brought them close to the Torah. And because he was a man of peace, a caring and loving soul, there was not a single person who did not cry his death. And so too Dr. Rosenberg. He was a doctor and also a great human being, an astute and caring person, a kind and generous man. But most of all, he was loved by everyone. And in fact, Dr. Rosenberg, he was just a very difficult man not to love. It was just so easy to love him. And it was very much like Aharon. I want to tell you about another coincidence. Dr. Rosenberg's name is Albert, of course, but also in Hebrew, Avraham. And in my opinion, that too is not a coincidence, because the first Jew, his name was also Avraham Avinu, our forefather Abraham. And Avraham Avinu, our forefather's life was remarkable. He defied the odds at every turn. He survived the most difficult situations. First, he leaves his home, his country, and he travels to a new land. And when he arrives there, there's a famine. His wife is taken from him on 2 occasions, and he fights mighty kings to free his nephew Lot. And the rabbis even tell us that he was thrown into a fiery furnace, and he survived. Some would call Abraham a survivor. I call Avraham Avinu a fighter. And when I think about Dr. Rosenberg, I think of much the same. A true fighter with a true Jewish fighting spirit. He too defied the odds at every turn, defied the most difficult and survived the most difficult situations. And this past year, I had the great honor of celebrating Dr. Rosenberg's 100th birthday. That is a remarkable feat. And it's a feat that really is a testament to his strong spirit. I want to end with just one last story that was told to me by his daughters, Faye and Cheryl, who I have to say, and also Joseph is here, his son, I have to say that you are to be commended for the tremendous, tremendous honor that you showed to your father, your tremendous kibud horim, which is remarkable. And Faye and Cheryl shared to me, I arrived from Israel just last night, and we had Skyped many, many times. And they shared to me a very touching story that I think encapsulates the life of Dr. Rosenberg. In his last days, he suffered a heart attack. And while he was on that table, he knew very well, he was a doctor, and he knew very, very well what was happening, and that these were probably the last days of his life. And while he was on that table, he called to the doctor and to the nurses, and he gave them an order. And he said, get the anesthesiologist to put me out. And that was Dr. Rosenberg, giving instructions, organizing the situation, being in control, even as he was breathing the last breaths of his life. He taught those around him, it's not over until it's over. Live life to its fullest at every moment and enjoy life until your last breath. May his memory be blessed. May his soul be bound in the everlasting bond of life. And may we all say Amen. There are a number of eulogies that we will have today. And I'd like to start, first of all, by calling Faye Rosenberg Albert's daughter.
I hope you'll all be patient with us. We seem to have a lot to say. My father was born November 7th, 1918. He was born Avram Rosenberg, no middle name, came to Canada with his older sister, who decided they should have English names, and he became Albert, and with his younger sister Sylvia, and his parents, who decided it was time to go when the Bolsheviks took over their house and the commander's wife decided they might like to have Aunt Roz as their own. When he started school in Winnipeg, he refused to speak English, only Russian, and my Aunt Roz was called in to fix that. When he bought Ivan Rebrov records when I was a teenager and he listened to Russian folk music over and over, he complained that when he came he could only speak Russian and now he couldn't speak a word. My dad lost his dad when he was about 8 and was introduced to religious life by the old men in the shul who would correct him aggressively if he stumbled over Kaddish. Why they asked him to say Kaddish at the age of 8, I don't know. And they'd give him alcohol as a joke. His mother had to come find him asleep in the snow after one such minyan. So my dad was never much of a shul goer, but he always had respect for Rabbi Ben Rosh and for the other rabbis in our lives that were so good, kind to us. Until I turned 14, and then I got involved in our NCSY youth group, and I decided to go to shul every Shabbos. Daddy bought a fur coat and put me behind him where the wind wouldn't get me and walked with me to shul in 40 below weather. That was my dad. If you wanted to do something badly enough, he would help you. But back then, when he was only 8, he effectively became the family patriarch from a very, very young age, always responsible for others and always assuming responsibility. He grew up in the Depression and learned very early how to get along. He learned hard work and perseverance from his mother, who raised 4 children by herself, but only with good humor. Partly in a 2-bedroom apartment not far from here, where there were 4 of them and Babi Rahama and a boarder. One day she decided they were a little gloomy and she decided to learn to ride the bicycle, which she then proceeded to ride through the living room and almost out the second floor window. They were a little gloomy about something, but she knew how to cheer them up. I remember my dad and Aunt Sylvia laughing till they cried as they remembered that day. My dad, he knew how to treat people with respect, and he especially knew how to listen, molded by his mother and their struggle for existence. By all accounts, he was a bit of a scrapper. Uncle Mervyn came along later while they lived in the US, but my dad and his sister Sylvia had a reputation for being really, really close. Sometimes he used to call me Sylvia by mistake when I was young. I was quite flattered. But apparently they could fight with each other as much as they were close. When they were kids, they would fight each other, but if something came to threaten their family or their relationship, they would fight the world in defense of their family or protect each other. When Uncle Merv got polio, my dad carried him up and down stairs to an apartment that was not on the first floor. He was a big brother to a little brother who didn't have a father, so my dad filled in wherever he could. He had an incredible sense of wonder in the world for his whole life. There was a story they used to tell about him taking his brand new bicycle apart just to see how it worked. But he couldn't figure out how to put it back together again, and his father was maybe not pleased, but he got down on the floor and helped him. He shared his interest in science and nature with us as long as I can remember, taking us on rides to the Morden experimental farm in the summer to see what they were grafting to get new fruit trees. He loved his talks these years with Jan, who could explain the stars to him. But when we were kids, he was already one of the only dads who figured out how we could safely watch a solar eclipse. And there were trips to the zoo and the goose sanctuary and a stop on the highway on one of our wonderful car trips to watch the northern lights. When we traveled on a car trip to Expo 67 in Montreal, we stopped at Rockcliffe Airfield near Ottawa, where he looked up at a plane in the museum under the wing, and he said, "I worked on this plane." We were never really sure if he was serious because he was a terrible tease. He was a mechanic in the Air Force, where even a poor person could get 3 meals a day and still send money home to his mother. He got to eat regularly, and he learned to put the planes back together after you took them apart. When you needed to fix something, it was my dad everyone would go to. Our kids always knew that Zeta could figure out how to fix something or build something or fix them if they were sick. In the last couple of years, he met Carl and marveled at Carl's ability with technology. I think he so looked forward to his days with Carl because he's a kindred spirit, someone who could figure it out and make something happen just by using brains and hands and hard work. And he has 2 engineering grandchildren who work on things that astonish him. His wonder extended to human accomplishment. I remember being taken to see a Salvador Dali exhibit at the WAG. He listened to classical music and Russian and Yiddish folk music. He bought a Cadillac convertible and took us on a car trip to BC where we could marvel at the mountains with the top down. That car got 6 miles to the gallon, but it was worth the view and the fun. When the Pan Am Games came to Winnipeg, the first time, he volunteered as a doctor and took us to swim meets and diving at the new pool, marveling at the skill of the athletes. He invited one of the visiting doctors to dinner, and they debated whether 1 alcoholic drink a day made you an alcoholic as they sipped a drink before dinner. My parents loved Limoud because of all the discovery. Daddy didn't even miss Limoud one day after the Shiva for my mother ended because he knew how much she loved it. This year, my dad forgot his hearing aids, which he always thought shouldn't matter if everyone would just speak clearly and stop mumbling. He was really looking forward to Stephen Schipper's sessions, but he couldn't hear it. So afterwards he called Stephen and asked if he had a copy, and Stephen came over and delivered his session in its entirety just for him. And he loved it. It was brilliant. A few years before at Limoud, he challenged Rabbi Tzvi Hirschfield, a previous Limoud scholar, to a sort of verbal duel over belief in God, which made Tzvi laugh and think. He will always remember his trip to Winnipeg and how hard he had worked to keep my dad at bay. There must have been something attractive about a young, slender medical student that convinced my mother to give up her career and take on my dad as her lifelong project. He adored her all his life, which didn't stop him from playing practical jokes on her when they were newlyweds, like asking her to wind the alarm clock before they went to sleep. It was a brand new electric clock. He told us that one time he was in the bay with his mother, and as they were going up or down the escalator, Bobby spotted my mother and told him, "That's the girl you should marry." She knew my mother because Bobby Fega had brought her to the beach to have a summer vacation and entrusted her to my other Bobby. So he wooed her and pursued her and married her on the hottest day of the year at 107 degrees in the shade. And he carted her off to Saskatchewan on locums and driving adventures that she would never have imagined. And she took on my dad as her professional career, making sure he was Dressed well, the house was in order, taking messages and tracking my dad down to call the patient back, who called Mrs. Doctor to get help finding him. Hosting mall medical parties to make friends of colleagues. She tolerated and encouraged his adventurous spirit and calmed him when he took on a Don Quixote-like charge, and taught him about customer service and made his family her family and raised his kids. And so many of people called them Uncle Albert and Auntie Lily. 3 generations of Mallons called him Uncle Albert. He actually, after he'd seen Tobin for a visit, he would tell me, "He's so smart, that little one. He's so smart." Our cousin Marty Charlotte wrote to us last night, "Sincerest condolences on the passing of your dad, who was always Uncle Albert to us as kids, with an older adult cousin we would not call by a first name out of respect a generation ago. May he be at peace after an incredible lifetime marathon as a loving husband, father, an incredible family doctor to thousands, and be with your wonderful mum in Gun 8. Some memories. I went fishing with him in high school along with my dad and Saul Gorovich on the Winnipeg River. Just Jews fishing for gefilte fish. We had a good time even though it was raining most of the weekend. One of my first patient encounters as an early 4th-year student was making rounds with him at Misericordia Hospital. He had such a kind bedside manner that has stayed with me during my career. Also, all the long car trips. He enjoyed so much seeing relatives who were out of town. Lil and Albert came to San Diego for Daniel's bar mitzvah, and we had a special breakfast with him and my dad and Daniel in Lajola after Shacharit on the Thursday before the bar mitzvah. We went out for breakfast afterwards, and he thought the portion size were too big in the USA. We had such a wonderful time in San Diego with your folks. We were blessed to have them with us at our simcha. Please send our condolences to Cheryl Joseph and your entire mishpacha. Our thoughts and prayers and love are with all of you. He was doctor, uncle, cousin, and many called him friend. We talked to Gordon Pullen yesterday. He commented that my dad had lived a full life and it was his honor to be his friend. Let me tell you a little more about his loves. He loved gardening and growing vegetables. Somewhere there's a picture with a little tiny Cheryl next to this biggest pumpkin on the block from the house in Silver Heights that had a big garden. And when we wanted to know why he was growing tomatoes bigger than everyone else and bigger than ever before, we found out he planted expired birth control pills in the ground and gave them a little hormone boost. He was always creative in his solutions. He was jealous of his Israeli cousins who were farmers and boasted about the fruit and grapes and wine they produced. When I was a kid, we made pickles every year. We'd get a bushel of baby cukes and we'd put up jars and jars of pickles that lasted till late in the winter. My job was placing the little cukes tightly in the bottom of the jar because my hand was small enough. My dad finished the job by sealing those jars with the strength of his incredible hands. He would have loved to be a farmer, an Israeli farmer, I think. His love for the land of Israel was visceral. It was so connected to the land itself and the things that can be grown, the shape of the land, the fruits, the people, the pioneer spirit of Chalutzim. My mother was a Zionist, but my dad was Israeli in his heart. He didn't want to be here without his Lily. So sometimes when I'd ask what he was doing, he would be discouraged. Like when I told him in May this year that Harvey was planting, he said, came back with a sort of discouraged answer. He wouldn't bother this year. What for? But a week later, he was out with Carl buying tomato plants. He grew pumpkins and corn and vegetables on Fiddler Avenue in Silver Heights in St. James, but our yard in River Heights wasn't that big, and for many years we had apple trees that made it too shady for some things. But this year, Daddy and Carl went out to buy plants, and this year he planted corn and sunflowers and chili peppers. The words were, "It's enough already, time to go," or "She was supposed to go first, she'd know what to do." The actions were, "Well, if I'm still here, I better do something new and interesting." He loved the product of that garden. Sometimes he'd say he didn't need so much to eat, and however, in the last few years, he found new places to go out to eat and new foods to enjoy. One of his favorites was fish and chips, especially when his grandchildren visited. At a place at Forks, where his rapport with the woman who owned it was something to behold. He was a fan, and she was his fan. He collected fans and friends all over the place. Lately, he told Carl he was eating too much and needed to diet. Carl tells us he didn't want to be too heavy for his grandchildren and our beloved friends to carry him. He loved traveling and driving, but he loved no trips better than his trips to Israel. And he was an adventurer. He drove through the Sinai when it was still in Israeli hands and got a little lost, but some soldiers found him. They asked if he was lost, and he agreed he could use some help getting back to the highway. And could they help him figure out what was wrong with this bottle of juice that he'd bought that tasted way too sweet? It was a bottle of concentrate. They took him back to their base, gave him something to eat, diluted the juice so he had a bottle of drinkable liquid, and led him back to the highway. He loved that adventure. It was about 1972, and he came back from that trip with a beard, and Joseph wouldn't speak to him for weeks. Between adventures, he was a hard worker, shuttling from hospital to office to house calls, to the pool at the YMCA that I remember to do laps, and more. When he was young, he worked and shared his earnings with his mother. He went to work in his uncle's bag factory when he finished school and carried more than his weight in burlap bags. And he had a job after that delivering for Oscar's Deli until he was in an accident and the bike got all twisted. His father had died in a car accident. So then he signed up for the Air Force and became a mechanic. He used to joke that was how he could afford to eat 3 meals a day, but I'm not sure it was really a joke. As a vet, he was entitled to education, and he became a doctor like his uncle, attending university paid for by Canada. They could say no to admitting Jews anytime they wanted, but they couldn't deny entrance to someone who'd just come back from the war. He always told us he wasn't a good student, but still, he could recite that terrible poem we all had to learn in school that started, Abu Ben Adam, may his tribe increase. Well, he knew all the words 40 years later after he'd studied it, and I couldn't get it straight just a week later after I was supposed to memorize it. He had extraordinary memory, and he could figure things out, an analytical skill that served him well as a doctor. I got a tiny little bit of that analytical ability, no memory, but I can do the pattern and trend recognition. The other thing that made him a good doctor was his ability to listen. He always had a calming effect on so many people. Well, maybe not always on his children. He could push Cheryl's buttons any day of the week, anytime he wanted to get a rise out of her. I told you he was a terrible tease. But when he wanted to, he could calm you right down and convince you everything was okay. There are a few people in the world that can do that, and having them leave the world makes them slightly less okay. When I first wrote university exams, I could score the multiple choice questions right away and figure out the grade, and it wasn't pretty. My first ever exam, he looked at me and said, I didn't want to go to university. I didn't have to. After that, I loved biology, even if I barely got a B. I told you, he could calm you down. He had a sort of magic with babies. When Joseph was a baby, he would pick him up out of his crib, show him proudly to the company, and then pat his back and put him back to sleep. He could calm any baby because he was calm. When we flew to Israel the first time, we were on an overnight El Al flight, and I would sleep and then wake up and see my dad walk by with a baby, and then I'd fall asleep and wake up as he walked by with another baby. And again, I don't know, he was insomniac, but there must have been a dozen families on the plane, and he just kept giving the mothers a break and putting the babies to sleep. And he was Dr. Rosenberg to an extraordinary number of people for a very long time. 35 years in practice, a long association with the Mall Medical, and now Patients still tell us stories about a diagnosis he made that no one else could figure out, or a treatment he obtained that no one else would try to get for them, or the kindness he showed when they were grieving a loss. Interestingly enough, most of them never knew that he couldn't remember their names, because he knew everything else about them, their joys and sorrows, their illnesses and successes, their families and careers. When I was a teenager, I learned to walk away and let people ask him medical questions in public places. He never turned them down. Or introduce myself so he could hear them say their names. He would tell stories of things he saw in practice, but never who the story was about. He would marvel at the miracle of childbirth or the limits of medicine. He would rail against bureaucracy or structure that prevented someone from getting the treatment they needed. I remember him advocating for an older person who was not offered surgery because of their age, other similar causes. We still hear stories from people who he delivered and then looked after their children. Cheryl and I used to go on house calls with him sometimes in the summer. Of course, we'd have to stay in the car, but we'd drive to a new neighborhood just for the ride, keep him company. When my kids were little and I was on my own for some summer evening for some reason, I used to go for a drive to a new neighborhood and find a new playground just for the adventure. He was so proud of the 4 generations of doctors in the family who all graduated from the University of Manitoba Medical School. He tried to pitch all of the kids on becoming doctors at one point or another. And he was harassing Lorraine to study more and requalify as a nurse in Canada. Adam is in Tel Aviv studying for an exam in medical school, where we know Zeta would approve. He was honored in his lifetime for his skill as a doctor, but most people don't know that from time to time patients would show up at our door and he would welcome them in. I came with a little medical emergency when it was a weekend. My mother served tea to the spouse or parent, and my dad looked after the hurt. One night someone came for advice and he took them downstairs out of our sight, talked for a long time, and afterwards he mumbled something about their needing legal advice. He could listen, and then he could get to the essence of the matter. He was relied on by many people for advice in lots of different spheres. I once asked him when was a baby ready to give up sucking. He looked this quizzical look and asked me why I would want to know that. A Jewish trait, answering a question with a question, something I used my whole life. After a little back and forth, he said, "The baby will tell you when he's ready." His boss, Genevieve, wrote to us. She said, "Please accept my condolences on the loss of our dear friend, Dr. Rosenberg, fondly known as Rosie in our workplace. I had the opportunity and privilege to work with Dr. R for many years at the Misericordia Hospital, known today as the Misericordia Health Center. Being a well-known and respected staff physician who served in many leadership roles, he established occupational health services there. He provided medical care for both his patients and the healthcare workers, which fully exemplified the facility's core values of caring, respect, and trust. Through our professional time together, we had ongoing discussions of who was the boss, as not always did he agree with the establishment, and most often thought they were not always in the best interest for those he was providing care. His rebuttal was, rules were made to be broken. I'm sure his dear Lily would have had something to say about that. As time, when he was continually able to reinvent his role, finally creating the position of bed manager, which I'm confident to say that the healthcare system would be well served if that role existed today. Many fond memories of a prescription of hard work, much humor, and much love and respect for those who work together. He touched us all in a special way that ensured that we put the well-being of patients and the healthcare workers first. I am sure he would want me to say that this concept now seems to elude our politicians of today. The memories of humor are many, but the one that stands out for me was his enthusiasm for his lunchtime swims in his favorite abbreviated swimsuit. I can still see him walking through the halls, cheerily encouraging anyone he encountered to join him. Rest in peace, my friend. Every moment of your life well spent. Genevieve Thompson Kirkpatrick. My dad's wonder in the world lasted a lifetime. He learned from anyone which made him willing to try practical approaches to medicine that others might have discarded. And my dad knew his way around the city better than all of us. He used to say, "You always make house calls on kids and old people. You can't take a chance." But I guess that also gave him a perspective on the whole person and their family. It also meant that he traveled everywhere. He could tell you the right route to take and get all the green lights, even when he could no longer see where we were. Zeta loved doing things for his grandchildren and his children and for all kinds of people. But he never wanted anything for himself. Getting him to buy new clothes was a challenge my mother was up for. I was with her in a department store in some city we were visiting on a car trip when she tried on a suit jacket in the men's department to see if it would fit him. She wasn't going to drag him to try it on until she knew. But he couldn't stop giving his grandchildren gifts. Carol reminded me that at his 100th birthday, he was giving out $100 bills to all the kids, including her. Benjamin called him almost every Friday, and every time he would tell me about it, it was with amazement that the kids wanted to talk to him. When Rachel called, he was in heaven, the youngest girl. Mayer pointed out that this would be one of those events that, when I told him all the kids were coming, he would have said, "Tell them it's not necessary. Don't bother with all that just for me." Mayer says every time I've said goodbye to Zeta on the phone or in person, no matter how he was doing, or even if I told him I felt fantastic, he'd end with, "If there's anything I can ever do for you, just give me a call." In fact, the last time they spoke, he was calling just to check in to know that Mayer was okay. He taught Mayer to use a table saw, even when he couldn't see it, and instilled a love of carpentry in him. Come to think of it, Joseph still has the desk he built especially for him to fit exactly in his room. He loved having all the kids around every Friday as much as my mom did. He just wanted everyone to be quiet. I inherited that noise averse trait too, but not with babies. As each child grew into a teenager and adult, he began the intellectual conversations about their studies and asked about their plans for their careers and their future. We'll have to make those plans without him now, with just his memory on our shoulder, whispering in our ears. Cheryl and I once had an incredible conversation with my dad where he announced that he only wanted a graveside funeral, no speeches. We looked at him and said, "No, funeral's not for you, it's for us. And we're not standing at the graveside. We're here because we need this way of parting from you." Cheryl stood there with you in 4 or 5 hospitals, Daddy, minute by minute, ensuring you were comfortable as much as possible, that every possible need was anticipated and filled. No daughter could be more devoted than my sister, who made sure he went out to restaurants he loved and had things to entertain him and kept him company and played his favorite news shows, usually the ones with Emily in them. She has done more than most human beings could even imagine to keep my dad alive and engaged. As Benjamin said to me the other day, it was a good run. We got 5 good years with him after Bobby died, when we knew he didn't want to be here. That's entirely to Cheryl's credit, and maybe a little to Lorraine's. Lorraine came to us when my dad was in Seven Oaks, and his sight got worse, and he was blind, and he was immobile, and there wasn't enough staff, and they kept leaving him notes on the tray. And Lorraine came into our lives and began to take care of him in a way that no one could have imagined possible, with extraordinary care and respect and planning and training of others to make sure that every need and wish was anticipated. Thinking ahead to plan each activity and moment, anticipating where his fork would land on the plate, and making sure his favorite bite was there. Setting up the shower to be foolproof. Caring for him even to the extent of saying no to going out on the ice so he wouldn't spend another winter in the hospital. And he didn't. The rain we've seen in the last week, what an angel on earth looks like. Your care in the last days of life was nothing short of perfection. Honoring his dignity, making sure that the father we knew was evident with his hair washed and combed, even when he wasn't awake to know. You and Carl have shown our father only respect and care and good humor. Carl planted the garden and rigged up the Wi-Fi in the hospitals and set up podcast playlists. And hey, Google, Carl, I don't know if you actually like Sunday brunch waffles and omelets, but if you do, I'll make them anytime for you. We hope that we will laugh with both of you and you will share meals with us for all the years to come. You're now part of our family forever, and we expect to be invited to your citizenship ceremony. Levy and Donnie and Tessie came to cover the evenings and nights and early morning showers and breakfasts and brought more friendships and blessings into our lives. Tessie was telling us the other night that she'll miss his advice living alone in a house. She could ask him questions about how to manage it. All the folks from Cindy St. Hilaire's Blossom Senior Care have been incredible and wonderful as my dad's needs increased and we needed to cover more shifts. We're grateful for all the blessings that came into our lives and his in the last few years. Before I finish my rambling about 100 years of his life, I want to think a little bit about what I learned from my father. Use your common sense, even if it isn't so common. Always learn from everyone. Learn new things. Don't be afraid of change. Listen to the baby. Listen to your heart. And find adventure. We'll miss your advice, your diagnoses, your practical response to a situation, and so much more. But we can celebrate 100 years of life. Several people said to me in the last few days that my dad was unique. My dad said, you see a lot of different things in 100 years. We should all follow his example and be ourselves. Be unique. Be brave. Bye, Daddy. Say hello to Mother for us. Rest in real peace.
For the second eulogy, Albert's son, Joseph Rosenberg.
It's always a mistake to try and speak after Faye. In the last couple of days since my father passed, I've had numerous emails from family and friends with memories of our dad. They remember him as warm and funny, often the center of the party or whatever was going on in the middle of the room. They remember his fierce independence. They remember him fixing their backs by stepping on them with no training in chiropractic, but it worked. They remember his unwavering devotion to our mother. They remember his generosity and how they always felt welcome and wanted in our parents' home. In the true tradition of my father's namesake, Avraham, and Avraham's beloved wife, Sarah. My mother, Leah, was his Sarah. They remember his indomitable spirit, his adaptability, his endless curiosity. Our dad was all of those things and so much more to so many people. He was also very complex emotionally and intellectually. He could be radically liberal at one moment and far to the right or libertarian at others. He was certainly never politically correct. It all depended on the topic being discussed, but in regards to any given idea, he was consistent in his views, though his views were not stagnant and evolved over time as the world changed around him. Despite his generous spirit, he could be harsh, and certainly the word difficult comes to mind. But you don't get through the life he was forced to lead at certain points and chose to lead at others and make it to 100 without being difficult. Great leaders of the world and great artists are seldom described as uncomplicated people who love to compromise. My dad always had his own way of doing things, sometimes conventional, but as we all know, often not. As a physician, he never hesitated to think outside the box, nor would he accept a compromise on behalf of his patient because convention dictated that this is the way it should be done. A standard of care would only be his standard when it worked. If one path didn't work, he would find another. The word relentless comes to mind when a patient's life or well-being was at stake, or even perhaps their marriages. There are bureaucrats, politicians, and colleagues whose lives he made miserable for refusing to do the right thing on behalf of his patients. He never stopped. When circumstances dictated, and sometimes even when not, he could be harsh, highly critical, at times even abrasive. Our father grew up in poverty. His childhood was punctuated by the tragic loss of his own loving father at such a young age, and he learned very early that it required toughness and backbone to survive and protect his own family. This sometimes translated into a lack of tenderness with his own children. He expected toughness and backbone from us too. It's easy for a child to construe this as a lack of affection. He was very demanding and expected no less from us than he expected from himself. All of you who knew him will certainly attest to what he expected of himself. A lofty goal for all of us to emulate, indeed. It took many years for me to understand what this really meant. His expression of love was seldom in words, but instead in his deeds. He supported our pursuits as long as they were taken seriously, and he and our mother always had our backs. I understand now that the words, "I love you," don't mean much if they are associated with abandonment in a time of need. Abandonment was not in his vocabulary. In all facets of his life, he remained loyal to those he cherished and true to his word. So what have I learned from this extraordinary life my dad lived? Faye outlined it, really. I'm not going to. But the answer to that question is, well, a lot actually. Although he spent his life dispensing advice to so many, he didn't actually advise me in most aspects of my life very often. He could be critical, but for the most part, he left me to be myself, at least eventually. But at some of the most critical points of my adult life, when I was faced with decisions that were only ones he could help me make, he was there. He led me to understand what my duties in life were, even at times when they left me terrified. I want to share a couple of conversations that we had many years apart. Most of you will likely recall the 2003 SARS epidemic, at which time I was faced with a potentially devastating choice. I was a young critical care physician in a community hospital that was designated a SARS center in the second half of the epidemic, done by the government after the CEO of the hospital sold us down the river to get funding for a new hospital to be built at our sister site, where I never worked. We had no appropriate isolation facilities in the old building, and doctors and nurses we had all known had already gotten sick and died caring for SARS patients at other hospitals. We were given no choice as a hospital. The various teams of administrators, doctors, nurses, and engineers remarkably built isolation rooms, and the staff were equipped and trained in a matter of 2 weeks before the patients started flowing into us. We critical care physicians were not being forced to work in this unit, but it was clear that we were being asked to do so. I had young children, as did others. Rachel was less than a year old, and Hannah was only 5. They were babies. As the new unit was being staffed, I had to decide what to do, at which point I turned to my dad, a telephone call I will never forget. He asked me only a few questions. Can you look after the patient safely? Do you have the skills required to do this? He reminded me that there has never been a time in history where a physician or a nurse looking after sick patients did so without some degree of personal risk. I answered him that I thought that we had learned from the mistakes that had taken place previously and that we had equipped the new unit the best that we could. I told him the truth, that I was one of only a few docs with the necessary skill set to look after these patients. Only critical care physicians could do this. It was at that point he said unequivocally that I must do it, that it was my responsibility to do it because I could. It was at that point that I did what was the right thing, and my fear began to subside, though it never completely went away. Conversely, 12 years later, when circumstances changed in my hospital and the model of care in my ICU was changing, which was unfortunately entirely out of my control, I faced the agonizing decision whether to continue doing critical care, which I loved, in a situation which I considered untenable, or to resign. My then 96-year-old father again listened and said just as unequivocally that it was my time to stop. Both times, of course, he was correct. I have learned from him the concepts of devotion, fidelity, integrity, self-sacrifice, lifelong learning, independence of thought, intellectual elasticity, to live without fear and be adaptable to change, especially as I watched him learn to adapt to the new reality of his blindness in recent years. It was remarkable to watch as his eyesight disappeared and him trying to pick up food with a fork, which in the beginning ended in his lap, and in recent years always made it directly to his mouth. He never instructed me in these concepts, and in fact, in truth, he lacked most of the necessary skills to nurture a student. He was a terrible teacher. He just lived his life this way, and I and my sisters learned to watch and take it all in. More often than not, he left us awestruck by his abilities and his sensibilities. He continued to see a remarkable amount despite being completely blind. His eyes were not his only source of vision. His decisions in life were not always correct, and near the end of his life, many personal choices were certainly not what can be best described as ill-advised. But whatever those decisions, they were true to his ideals. Being true often means being difficult, and being difficult can be painful. There is no other way. He lived and died this way. He only ever lived his own truth. There was never compromise in that. My mother and my father were the anchors in our lives, and we're now suddenly left adrift. We have only their blessed memories to guide us now, and not their actual words. But it is the greatest comfort to know that in almost any given circumstance, and my sisters will agree and say the same thing, I can ask myself, what would Mother and Daddy do? How would they answer? How would they respond? What would they advise? And nearly always, we know what the answer will be. We don't have to hear it from them, from their mouths. Their long lives lived with such integrity leave us with this legacy. They continue to provide their guidance, their example for a moral and just existence, even in their physical absence. In my mind, this is the greatest gift they have left for their children and their grandchildren. This is the love of a true parent. I just need a moment. I have another eulogy to read that was written by my nephew Adam, who cannot be here. He just finished his third year of medical school, of which his Zeta is so proud. And in a few days, he has to write his medical licensing exam. And we had all told Adam, and he knows this, that completing that exam, which is crucial to his future, is what his Zeta wanted him to do. He understands this. And we are missing him. Adam sent this small essay overnight, and his email said that he didn't have a chance to edit it. He thinks it should be edited. And I said to him, this doesn't need editing. So I'm going to read this in Adam's words. This is Adam speaking. When I was just a boy, Zeta and I went canoeing. I think I was about 7 or 8 years old, but I don't really remember. The water was calm and we paddled for a while, mostly in silence. I was in front and Zeta was in the back. At some point, the weather changed and we found ourselves paddling against a strong headwind and larger waves. We were pushed into a cove, and as the waves bent around the land ahead, they began to cross with the waves that were hitting our side. They towered up, splashed over our boat, and pushed us backward. I turned around and saw Zeta. I said, Zeta, the waves are getting bigger. He said, yes, Adam, they're crossing. I said, Zeta, we have to paddle hard. And he said, yes, Adam, we do, our hardest. That was my Zeta. That was Albert Rosenberg. No matter the obstacle, he was right there behind you, paddling his hardest and pushing you through all the wind and waves that would come your way. Zeta was a man of the greatest generation, the generation that was called upon to fight the Second World War and then rebuild the world. He never stopped being a man of his time. The military was called the service, and gas was pronounced gaz. And the only difference between a fascist and a communist was that one hated Jews and the other hated Jews. He was already 29 years old when he saw the birth of the State of Israel. When he started practicing medicine at the age of 34, there were no ultrasound CTs or MRIs. Measles, mumps, rubella, and polio were still commonplace. It was still in this world that Zeta was a young man in his prime. By the time I came around, that was all long gone. But Zeta was still a product of his time. Life was not about self-fulfillment or having fun. This was modern, superficial nonsense invented by a generation that had been given too much gratuitous free time and education. Rather, life was about responsibility, duty, and the honor of caring for others. One was obligated to use whatever abilities he or she had to fulfill those values. And anything less was a disappointing abdication, or worse, selfish. I think you heard me say those same words in my story, and Adam and I didn't confer when we wrote these. Hard work was life's currency, and being a good student was the easiest way to bring a smile to his face. When a grandchild brought home a 97% on a test, his favorite pastime was to ask, so, what happened to the other 3%? Admittedly, I didn't provide him too many opportunities for him to ask this question. And he was never that interested in finding out what happened to the other 38%. Yes, I was a terrible student, and it got under his skin. In the second grade, he tried to bribe me into doing my homework. He offered me $80 for every A that I got on my next report card. The kid isn't self-motivated, but surely he can be bought. I don't know what irritated him more, that his grandson wasn't doing his homework or that I was too stubborn to take his money. I spent a lot of time in his house, a lot of time playing on the floor, playing in the basement, playing in the den, surrounded by his hundreds of books, tapes, relics from the old country, Inuit sculptures, a house filled by an insatiably curious mind. String theory documentaries, Jewish history documentaries, world history documentaries, encyclopedias, medical textbooks, taped concerts, and more. As I got older, I began to dig into his record collection. In his den, I heard for the first time the Mendelssohn and Beethoven violin concertos, as well as his favorite piece of music, the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. What was that instrument? Oboe? English horn? I just love that melody. It's the first symphony I ever saw. Zeta sat at the head of the table. Sophie, what have you done for the Jewish people this week? Lily, look how well they're doing. He would boast as my little cousins endlessly stuffed their faces. Can you spell the word economy? Woe to any grandchild who left food on his plate. Americans were a bunch of yahoos. Quebecois separatists were a bunch of anti-Semitic ingrates. May I please be excused? Won't you stay? Why don't you stay at the table a little longer? He was not above taking out his teeth at the table for entertainment, nor mine for that matter, as I discovered as a naive 5-year-old with a loose tooth. Come here, I'll help you with that. After each of my canoe trips, I would debrief him on how many kilometers we had done, how many sets of rapids, how many portages. He wanted detailed accounts of all the wildlife I saw. 10 years earlier, it was Zeta who took me to Fort White, the Seine River, and Okayamik Marsh. We would watch the white-tailed deer and see how the geese and ducks flew in formation, each one taking a turn to lead the flock, each one assuming his responsibility to group. He expected no less of me. Often it was little things. Walkways had to be shoveled, chairs carried, luggage moved, tables lifted, light bulbs changed. Age, size, or wind chills were never an excuse. Sitzfleisch, the ability to sit and study for long periods of time, the willpower that I never possessed, was a grandchild's most deliverable means of meeting expectations. Physical challenges were another. His handshake was a direct challenge. Let's see who can squeeze harder, and if it's me, how long you can tolerate the pain. Not until my late 20s did I ever win, but even at the age of 5, backing down was not an option. Even with the knowledge that I would lose every time, that there was no way to overpower his massive hands. His hands weren't massive, they just seemed that way. Not stepping up to the challenge was unthinkable. He didn't care to see a victory, he wanted to see the fight. Zeta was 100% confident that he was right. There was never any way to change his mind. He had a self-assurance that was ironclad and the willpower to back it up. He had a wicked temper and a withering way of expressing disappointment. With this self-assurance, he believed in his heart of hearts that his grandson was put on this earth for a life of responsibility, duty, and the honor of caring for others. He didn't ask me to agree with him, and I really don't think it concerned if I didn't. He had no doubt in what he believed, and nothing I could say or do would ever change his mind. For him, it was obvious. I was to fight his unbeatable grip and paddle my hardest regardless of the cost. The last time I saw Zeta, we were sitting in his den, and he asked me if I remembered the time we got caught in the waves. I said, of course, and that I thought about it often. That was a good day, he said. Those were big waves. With that same self-assurance, the same unshakable confidence, Zeta approached death. He had been threatening death for about 25 years, and as far as I can tell, he really had no fear of it. Still, after my Bobby passed away, I think something changed in him, and he began to welcome it as truly the last phase of his life. I cannot understand this. I do not yet know how someone is expected to go from being a little boy in an old man's house to bearing the responsibilities for the lives of others, to dutifully shepherding the generations as they go by, to embracing the honor of caring for your friends and loved ones as they fade away, and finally to the acceptance of death when the time is near. The best I can do is paddle my hardest and be guided by the path that Zeta so relentlessly blazed. There is a story from the Kabbalah about 2 waves on the sea. One wave becomes upset and the other asks why. The first wave says, there is a shoreline approaching, and when we hit the shore, we will die. We will no longer be waves. The second wave answers, don't worry, we're not waves, we're water. Zeta, today you are with the waves, and your shoreline is here. But the force of your wave continues to push us forward, just as you did so many years ago when I was a little boy. And you were right there behind me, and together we faced the wind and the water and all the forces that might someday come our way.
For the next eulogy, a friend, Julie Garofalo.
Good afternoon. My name is Julie Garofalo. I work at the Misericordia Health Center, and I'm very proud to call Dr. Rosenberg my friend. I first met Dr. Rosenberg in 1973 when I first began to work at the hospital. At that time, he was a staff health physician who attended to all employees, student nurses, and new staff. He examined and did a brief history on everyone. If you needed a prescription refill, he'd check you first and fill out the prescription. If you thought you had strep throat, he'd examine you and send off a throat swab. If you told him you thought you were dying, he'd reassure you, no, not today, and he'd send you home to rest. Come back when you feel alive, he'd say. He was special. He had a remarkable memory. He could remember everyone when they walked the halls. He was amazing. When I had my first child, I asked my obstetrician if I should get a pediatrician. He assured me that Dr. Rosenberg looked after his family and I did not need a specialist. Dr. Rosenberg was wonderful and never put me down for asking silly questions. I'll never forget when we first took our daughter home from the hospital and I changed her diaper for the first time. There were no health links and I had no family in Winnipeg. I thought my daughter had diarrhea, so I called Dr. Rosenberg. He didn't laugh at me, but assured me that was normal for a new baby. He even made a couple of house calls when my children were sick with croup and the measles. After staff health, he became manager of bed utilization for surgery. He would review patients' charts and get after surgeons who kept their patients admitted longer than necessary. This was before laparoscopic surgery. Patients were admitted the day prior to surgery and stayed in for a few days post-op. He didn't put up with any nonsense from any of the surgeons. He helped with bed control and made sure beds were available when needed. Christine Forsman, a former manager of the admitting department, told us this is where he learned to use a laptop. After bed utilization, Dr. Rosenberg shared an office with Gloria and I. He reviewed the patient histories to make sure they were fit for surgery. We have pre-anesthetic clinics that do that now. This is when we got to know Dr. Rosenberg really well. He was so proud of his grandchildren and would tell us stories all the time. He always asked about our husbands and our children. When we would ask him how he was feeling, he'd always say, I'm on the right side of the grass, and every day you wake up is a wonderful day. I could never pull the wool over his eyes. There was a particular surgeon who never completed his charts and was always suspended. I was supposed to cancel those surgeries. Booking was all done manually at that time, no computers, only a typewriter. I hated doing that because I would just have to reschedule them once he completed his charts. But Dr. Rosenberg knew me and he'd ask, Julie, did you cancel those cases? After he retired, he'd come to visit us every time he went to Tony's the barber down the street. After Tony retired, he still came to visit. A few years ago, when he could no longer see, I was concerned and asked him how he could catch a bus on his own. He told me he just put out his white cane and crossed in the middle of the street. This was Maryland. After that, we made sure that there was someone to help him cross the street. He was very happy when we made arrangements to go out for meals together. Lorraine reminded me of the time that the three of us took Dr. Rosenberg out for supper. It was Bellissimo's on Waverly. We didn't know how to get there from his house, and Dr. Rosenberg, who was blind, gave us step-by-step directions. He loved a good joke. He especially liked the surprise for his 80th birthday when Thelma jumped out of a box, dressed like a nun, and began to sing Climb Every Mountain. That was also the year he decided to grow a beard. Lately, he couldn't see people unless they were real close. Everyone knew Dr. Rosenberg. He was loved by everyone. He got so many hugs every time he came to visit. I asked a few people about their thoughts of Dr. Rosenberg, and the reply was always the same. He was always sweet and kind. A few of them even said he saved their lives. When he showed up on the wards, he would always smile and ask, "How are you ladies today?" He had a great respect for women. He was always a gentleman. He was genuine and honest. His mind was sharp to the end. He never stopped learning. Even when he could no longer see, he would listen to his audio tapes. Dr. Rosenberg's wife died about 5 years ago. She was the love of his life, and he always spoke highly of her. He often spoke of her and told us how he missed her. Now he is joined with his beloved Lily, and I'm sure he's smiling down on us. Rest in peace, Dr. Rosenberg. We'll miss you.
Last two eulogies are by his grandchildren, and I want to call for the first one, Jeremy Rose.
Can you hear me okay from here? I'll use my geriatric voice. Um, I don't know what an abbreviated bathing suit is, but for the record, it was a floral Speedo, and it was given to him by a drug company. When my grandfather was only 90 years old, we took him to Israel for what we thought might be the last time. And turns out it wasn't the last time. He went 2 more times after that. But he wanted to go with me someplace that he thought was really special. And so I took our rented car and we drove all the way to Har Hazeitim, which is the Mount of Olives. And for probably most people in the room, they're really familiar with that kind of panorama of the old city of Jerusalem. And Har Hazeitim is all the way around the other side. It's 180 degrees opposite to that. And from Har Hazeitim, you can look back upon the old city of Jerusalem, and you can see the entire old city stretched out in front of you as if it were done on purpose, as if someone had put it there just to look like that. And so I took Zeta around to the other side, and we looked back across at the old city. And that was not what he wanted to show me. He pointed out that just below us was a monastery, and in that monastery are olive trees. And those olive trees are very, very, very old. They're about 400 years old. And we're standing there, the two of us, looking at the olive trees. And he said a comment which I thought was telling, although I don't think he meant it this way, but he said, he was looking at the olive trees, and he said, you know what? They never really die. They don't die. They just move over. My Zeta, Albert Rosenberg, lived by any measure a long and fulfilling life. It was a good life. It was not an easy life. He was born in Belarus, and just before he was 2, his home was occupied by a Polish officer that was fighting the Belarusian army. And the Polish officer brought his own family. And they took a liking to my grandfather's older sister to the point where my great-grandparents were concerned they might take her away. And so my great-grandparents fled with their 2 children and went back through Poland, stopping to have another child, my Aunt Sylvia, whose daughter is here, on the way in Warsaw, and eventually made their way all the way to Canada and then down to Bayonne, New Jersey. And I talked with my grandfather, and his first memories were actually from Bayonne, New Jersey. That's where he remembers being a young boy. And his best friend in Bayonne was his own father, the first Joseph Rosenberg. And he would go with his own father, who was a milkman, and they would deliver milk house by house in a cart that was drawn by a horse that actually knew the way. So the horse would actually go house to house to house, and the horse knew which houses were supposed to get milk, and my grandfather would tag along. And he had very happy memories at that time. And when he was 8 years old, that came to an end, when his own father was killed in a traffic accident while he was at work. And for the first time, my grandfather said Kaddish. It was the first time that he felt the responsibility that he would carry with him for his entire life for other people. And it was the first time that he really knew that his childhood had come to a very abrupt end. He was 8. He was 8. My great-grandmother took her family without her husband back to Winnipeg where her own brother was. And my grandfather grew up not far from here. He continued to go to school, and he continued to be a troublemaking child. He would spread soap flakes around just to entertain himself, or he would sneak up behind the girl sitting in front of him and just very, very casually dip her long hair into the inkwell, which I'm sure they appreciated. And he grew up in the North End. When he finished high school, he worked in a factory, and he made just enough money to afford either 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day and cigarettes. So he smoked. And when war came along, he enlisted in the Air Force as an airframe mechanic. And for my grandfather, the war proved to be an enormous equalizer. Prior to the war, there was absolutely no chance that he ever would have gone to medical school. There was a quota. There were only so many Jews allowed in every year. And after the war, they were all service members. They had all served honorably. And a new dean, Dean Bell, was willing to let in Jews who were qualified, regardless of how many that meant letting into the medical school. My grandfather entered medical school and graduated in 1952. And I think it's really, really important to understand Zeta's relationship to medicine. My grandfather did not choose to become a doctor because it was his job. He did not choose to become a doctor because he wanted respect or social standing. And he certainly didn't choose to become a doctor because he wanted to get paid. In many respects, he didn't choose medicine at all. Medicine chose him. Being a doctor defined who he was. It made him the person he became. It gave purpose to the life that he led. And I know that there are some people in the audience who were his patients. And I think that you're probably here because of what he meant to you. But I want you to know what you meant to him. Taking care of you when you were sick, making house calls when you needed him, delivering your children, that was his life's calling. And these were the moments that gave Dr. Albert Rosenberg meaning. Even long after he retired, and he was retired for a long time, when a patient would come up to us in public, it was the highlight of his day. You would see him light up, and however sad he was, however frustrated he was at the many physical challenges he faced, that would all disappear. And Dr. Rosenberg was back, even for a brief moment. And you could see that was him. When I was in medical school, I thought it would be a good idea to go to India and do research. And after 3 days of traveling and more curry than my Ashkenazi stomach ever wanted, I woke up and I looked in the mirror, and my tongue had turned a pathologically interesting but socially awkward shade of green. And I looked in the mirror, and my exact words were, "Oh crap, I think this is a new low," except those weren't my exact words because Zeta would not want me to say what I said in real life. I called my uncle, who is a respirologist, and he had no idea what to do. I spoke to my aunt, who is a family doctor, who also had no idea what to do. I went to a local doctor there who suggested that I treat it with more curry, which was clearly not an option. And I called my Zeta. And I said, "Zeta, I am in this little town in India, and my tongue has turned green." And there was total silence on the other end of the phone. And so I repeated myself, "Zeta, I am in a small town in India, and my tongue has turned green." And from the other end of the phone, this voice came that said, Hydrogen peroxide, dilute it, rinse twice a day, it'll go away in a week. And I said, you've seen this before? And he said, sure. As if there were as if there were people in Winnipeg running around with green tongues for years and no one had bothered to check. And this was really no big deal after all. And I'm happy to report he was right. He's a great doctor. Joking aside, what my grandfather really was a doctor's doctor. My grandfather was the kind of doctor that other doctors would look to get a hard diagnosis. And he was the kind of doctor, and everyone in the profession knows this, that there are some people who can just take it to the next level and do that thing for patients that other people cannot do. That was my grandfather. I was sitting with him a couple of months ago, and he shared with me a series of letters that he had received from a patient. And this patient was in the military himself, and he'd been traveling, he'd been posted in various places. And he came into the office with his new family to see his new family doctor, who was my grandfather. And they'd seen countless other doctors. And my grandfather remarked, well, you have a very lovely 5-year-old boy. And the patient looked up at him and said, he's 10. He's 10 years old. And my grandfather put everything together right away and made the diagnosis. And he got that patient what he really needed, which was growth hormone. And that patient continued to grow and grew up as a normal child with a normal life because of that one very, very brief moment where my grandfather made that critical diagnosis. And so, as a thank you, that family sent letters to my grandfather for years and years and years as they continued on their travels and as he rose up in rank in the military. And reading these letters, you notice a couple of things. Number one, man, can these people write letters? They can really write letters. Number two, when that patient got to a certain point, he reached 5'5", which at that point was considered to be a respectable height. And the medical staff told him, growth hormone is a very, very scarce substance, and now we have to stop giving it to your child and give it to another child who needs it. And that would be a hard thing for any parent to hear, that we're going to take away the drug which is helping your child so that some other child can hear it. And I think to parents now, it would be an unthinkable thing to hear. But to people of my grandfather's generation and to these parents, it was the right thing to hear. These people had a remarkable sense of self-sacrifice and stoicism. The entire generation of people had a remarkable sense of self-sacrifice and stoicism. And I know that you're probably thinking about your own parents and grandparents, and you know this to be true. And my grandfather had that character absolutely in spades. He did not complain about physical discomfort. He did not complain when something was asked for him that he thought that he should do. And throughout his career, through crippling migraines and broken bones, and eventually to the loss of his eyesight, he persevered and persevered and persevered. He was an absolute rock. And he was unbelievably stoic. My grandfather, my Zeta, was a patient's doctor. And long before there were words like patient-centered medicine, which he hated, because what other kind could there possibly be, he knew how to put his patients first. And every time that I go into an exam room, I remember the advice that he gave me when I started medical school. He said, knock, always knock, smile, and ask how they're doing. He said, seeing a doctor is a scary thing. Having illness is a scary thing. And it's your job to cross that bridge and make your patients feel comfortable. That's your job. That's not optional. That's what you have to do. Bedside manner, and his bedside manner was second to none, is what you have to do. And that seems like kind of trite advice, but I will tell you, it's amazing how often it's overlooked. He had an unbelievable ability to calm any room. Even later in life, he would walk onto a hospital ward, which for many people is the scariest, most stressful place they will ever be. And he could sit down, talk to you, hold your hands with what were unbelievably, remarkably steady hands of his own, and make you feel that it was going to be okay. That somehow everything would be all right just because he was there. That was Zeta at his absolute best. He was a patient's doctor. He was his patient's doctor. My grandfather was a devoted, and I mean absolutely devoted husband. If he had to give the speech right now, he would start by mentioning my grandmother, my Bobby. In Judaism, we have the concept of beshert, of two people who are destined to be together. It's an idealized notion that everyone has a perfect match and that somewhere in the world there's someone out there who is just for you. And in reality, it probably doesn't apply to most marriages. Relationships just aren't that simple. It applied perfectly to my grandparents. Whether by luck or by design, they were really more like one person than two. They loved and took care of each other from the day they were married in 1948 until the day that she passed away in 2014. This was a tragedy that my grandfather had never anticipated. He was 6 years older than she was. And quite frankly, it was a tragedy that he never could ignore or recover from. As their grandchild, when I was with them, they would have this incredible way of making me feel special. You could sit at their kitchen table and you would feel like you were absolutely the only person in the entire world, that you had 100% of their attention. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that that probably wasn't entirely correct. That in fact, they had their attention. But what needed to be said between them was so good and so perfect that they didn't actually have to say it. They knew. And even when they were together, they were absolutely 100% and always together. Largely because of my Bobby, their perfect complement built a family together. She was adept at many of the things that he found frustrating. He was physically able to do many of the things that she could not. She cooked, she managed their finances, and he worked and took house calls on a special line that he installed so his patients could reach him day or night. In later years, he would carry things up from the basement and help her around the house or just bothered her while she tried to do real work. This cooperation even extended to some very unlikely activities, like driving. As his eyesight began to deteriorate, we realized that when they were in the car, she would do the seeing and he would do the driving. We called this seeing eye driving. And we kept sending him to AutoPack to try and get it fixed so that they would take away his license. Unfortunately, AutoPack also didn't seem to mind seeing eye driving, so it was several years before he gave up his license all on his own. And in fact, my Bobby was the only one who could ever really tell him what to do, usually in Yiddish, which was the language that they spoke when they didn't want us to understand. To say that my grandfather was stubborn would be an understatement in the extreme. After he broke his first hip in 2016, we spent a week together in Miami in a hospital. And I was leaving on a very early morning flight, and I got a call from the nurse who I'd left my cell phone with, and I said, call me for anything. 5:30, my phone rings, I pick it up, it's the nurse on the other end. What's wrong? I said. The nurse says, Albert asked me to get his shaving kit, and then he took an unlabeled bottle of pills, swallowed 2 of them, and now he's refusing to give the bottle back or tell me what they are. And I said, is he confused? And there was a long pause. And he said, Albert is not confused at all. And I said, let me speak to him. Zeta? Yes. I said, Zeta, you have to tell me what those pills are, and you have to give the nurse back the bottle. And he said, it was Advil, and I'm not giving it back. I spent about 10 minutes trying to reason with him, which of course didn't work, and I said, okay, pass me back to the nurse. And I said, unfortunately, I think you've just encountered Albert. And he's been that way for 98 years. Best of luck. That was Zeta. His stubbornness, though, had another side too, which I think we've actually all talked about, even though we didn't plan it this way. When my Zeta thought that something was morally correct, there was no way, absolutely no way, that you were going to convince him to do otherwise. He genuinely did not care what the consequences were to himself, or for that matter to other people, if he thought that it was for the good of one of his patients, or it was the right thing to do. You can call this stubbornness because that's what it was, but there's another name for it. It's called courage. My grandfather had raw, unfettered, and unbridled courage. When it was unfashionable to tell women to breastfeed, he told them to breastfeed because he thought that was the right medical decision. When drug reps tried to come to his office to tell him that his patients needed to be taking vitamins, he told them thank you, but no thank you. Actually, that's probably not what he said, but I won't repeat it. And he said, no, they need to eat right. Goodbye. When the medical establishment thought that being gay was a disease, he disagreed, and he wasn't shy about saying that. My grandfather decided what he thought was right, and then he approached it with absolute 100% courage. When I went to Tel Aviv to become an EMT during the Intifada, he said, go. When Emily enlisted in the IDF, he said, go. When I had a particularly hard case about 3 months into my practice after residency, I called him and I told him what had happened. And I told him that there was going to be a lot of fallout for it. And he said, you did the right thing. Stick to your guns. Don't back down. He had courage. And so we're standing on Hara Zaytim, and we're looking at the olive trees that don't die. They can't die. They just move over. And my Zeta spent his entire life building a legacy. It's not a legacy of wealth or recognition. It's not a legacy that can be bought or sold. It's a legacy of a life spent investing himself in the welfare of others. It's a legacy of getting up every single night to make house calls, deliver babies, or tend to some emergency. It's a legacy of raising a family and being completely devoted to his life partner. It's a legacy of giving himself to every patient, whether they had terminal cancer or a green tongue. And that legacy will live longer than even he ever could. That legacy is in this room now. And in that respect, my Zeta, Dr. Albert Rosenberg, hasn't died. He's just moved over to be with my Bobby, which is the only place that he ever really wanted to be. And as we go through our own lives, he would want us to care about other people, help when someone needs help, and always do the right thing regardless of the cost to ourselves. He would want us to complain less, do more, and be strong for those around us. That's what he did, and it's an awful lot to live up to. But my Zeta always had high standards. And now that he's moved over, it's our turn to do that too.
The final eulogy, granddaughter Emily Rose.
The day I left for Israel, my grandfather told me, "Don't be afraid of death. There are worse things." He knew them well. He'd seen them. He said goodbye to so many friends, all of his siblings, and finally the love of his life, my grandfather. He didn't fear death, but my theory is that death was afraid of him. So I stand here today with gratitude, only gratitude. 100 years is a long time, and I'll try to bring comfort to us all. But I think we should truly feel blessed. At this moment, I will tell you that when I was here last for my grandfather's 100th birthday, I said what I needed to say to him through the Dvar Torah I gave at synagogue for his birthday and the conversation we had after. I didn't want there to be things that were unsaid between us, and I will always have things I want to say to him and always want to hear from him, but I wanted it to be clear that he heard them in life. And remember that time when I gave that Dvar Torah, we were talking about Jacob and his wrestles with the angel. Im ki berachtani, only if you bless me. He asks the angel for his blessing before letting him go. And he's given a new name by God, Israel. And today I ask you to do as my grandfather did, to look at your struggles in the face and ask them to bless you. And today I think about how hard it must have been to be a prophet. Because prophets could see ahead of their time, and they knew that there were kings doing all sorts of things, political motivations, conquering land and conquests, and they knew the future, and they knew that their prophecies would most likely fall on deaf ears. But they spoke anyway. So here's the thing about my Zeta. Sorry, boys, but you know he would say this, that grandsons are fine, but granddaughters are better. Because we're truly grand. He loved us more. Okay, he didn't love us more, but but he loved us differently. Um, I know if he were here, we would get under each other's skin right now because he would say, Emma, I want grandchildren. And I would say, you have 10 grandchildren. And he would say, you know what I mean. And I would say, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. And I would get under his skin too. I'm going to talk about that. He empowered me. When I was 3, I used to wake up before everybody, of course, and because Zeta never slept, he would take me up onto his shoulders, and he would take me to the bathroom and close the door, and we would be very quiet not to wake the house, and he would put me up on his shoulders, and I would watch him shave. And I felt like a queen, sitting up on his shoulders while his blade meticulously went down his face, down the wrinkles on his face, mostly gray hair at that point. And I can still hear that blade going across his skin. And then he would see if I would be paying attention. He would say, did I miss a spot? And I would point to the shaving cream behind his ears. And he'd say, nothing gets past you, Big M. Where would I be without you? I'd still have shaving cream behind my ears. Anyone who has seen my brother Adam with children will tell you he literally does the same thing. He gives them a task and then he empowers them when they complete it. And he spoiled me as well. When I got my ears pierced, he wanted to buy me diamonds, so we went to the jewelers. But that week I just read about diamonds, the diamond industry in Sierra Leone. So it was my intolerance du jour. And he had lived through the Depression and World Wars and poverty, abject poverty, and he just wanted to buy his granddaughter diamonds, and she was refusing. So that was a little bit ironic. But we went to the jewelers, and he picked these for me because they have etches in them that look like diamonds, but they don't have diamonds. And they're a perfect fit. And that was him. He wanted to spoil me. What you likely remember about my grandfather is his hands. He had the strongest hands, the firmest hands, even in his final year. My brother has them. They were his tool, and his instinct was his technology. He saw, but he really felt. He was a blind doctor. Even when he couldn't see, he had foresight. And he was a model father to me, even though he didn't have a father for himself most of his life. And he was tough, but he was brave with his heart. Life had hardened him, tossing him so many challenges. But he was truly soft in nature. You would only know it if you watched the way he gently but firmly pet a dog, or held a child, or touched the leaf of a tomato plant, or made a bed with perfect hospital corners, or touched your forehead when you were sick, or touched my grandmother. Everyone thinks my Zeta was like an ox, but in his nature, he was a soft, gentle man. He loved classical music and romance and figure skating and dancing. He loved his garden. He was both strong and resilient and masculine, but also kind and sensitive and gentle, just like my Uncle Joseph. When you remember my Zeta, I'd like you to remember his mischief. When he stumbled around my bat mitzvah dinner with a bottle in a brown paper bag, which my grandmother was mad at, or when he was sitting really absolutely inebriated on the floor of his own living room with my Uncle Merv. I swear they'd been drinking the whole night, and I was at my bat mitzvah brunch, just in front of everybody on the floor. And he'd say things to provoke you just to get attention. And I like to remember the kick he got out of pissing someone off just a little bit, and the infectious laugh that came with it. And sorry, Rabbi, but he really did like lobster with butter. Adam made the mistake of one time bringing his girlfriend at the time to one of his recitals, which my Zeta flew to Montreal to hear. Whoever this young woman was went to sit with my Zeta, who couldn't see, but took her hands and told her she sounded pretty. And then that young woman went to my brother and said, well, now I see where you get it from. And I stand here today with gratitude in my heart for the nights I spent in the den on my Zeta's lap watching 60 Minutes in my pajamas, or listening to records of classical music, or cuddling with him in synagogue as I played with the tassels on his talit. I'm grateful for the times he made me breakfast while we listened to the radio, and I'm grateful for all the times, the countless times he cared for me when I was sick and drove me to and from school. I'm grateful for every time we were in a parking lot and someone rushed up to hug him saying, Dr. Rosenberg, and he would pretend he knew who they were for a full 10 minutes. But he couldn't remember everybody because he helped so many people. And I'm grateful for all the times he would say quietly in my ear, you should be proud of your mama. He used to say his trick for longevity was to flirt every day of your life. And he didn't want to live another day without being able to keep that promise. He loved his grandchildren and his children very much, and his siblings very much, and his cousins very much, and his nieces and nephews very much. And he loved his colleagues very much. But there was nothing and nobody he loved more than my grandmother. She was his oxygen. And she was the ground beneath his feet. And every moment he spent here without her, he was not complete. He used to kiss my grandmother every Shabbat in a way that was not just a kiss on the cheek. It was a kiss, and they were old. And he was still so attracted to her. It was like a real kiss. You were old. I think after 60 years, he couldn't believe that she still agreed to marry him and stayed with him. It's true that those last years of his life were difficult without her. I want to just say that when he came to visit me in Israel after I graduated from officers training school, I went to have coffee on the beach with my mother and my brother, who were both there. And I was worried because Bobby and Zeta were somewhere else. And they were like, no, they're okay. Because we look over onto the shore, onto the Tel Aviv shore. You all know what the beach looks like. And there they are, walking hand in hand very slowly on the beach together. It's true that the last years were difficult. He was a man who wasn't afraid of death. He had seen so many worse things. He said goodbye to so many. But somehow, in a way, I do believe death was afraid of him. He wrestled with it all the time, his whole life, but not on behalf of himself, on the behalf of others. And sometimes he lost, but he always rose to fight another day. And even though he was blind, he could always see. And this is the lesson of my grandfather. And it's the lesson of my people. The message in the Dvar Torah I gave was about resilience, which doesn't mean trying to avoid adversity, and it doesn't mean not conceding loss. Sometimes you do. It means never backing down without a fight. It means doing all you can, knowing the power you have in your hands, everything you have. It means not being able to define the terms of the fight sometimes, but not letting them define you. It means committing yourself to justice. defending the rights of the orphan, and making the case for the widow. It means that you're not incumbent to complete the task, but you're not absolved of it. And I'll remind you again that we're not the people of Moses or Abraham or Isaac or King David or King Solomon. We're the people of Israel. We are the product of our resilience. We are born of our struggles, with our actions and our work. And that day when my grandfather told me not to be afraid of death, I was very sick. I was at my uncle's. I somehow got sick just before I had to fly to Israel for the rest of my life. And Zeta stayed up with me all night. I was very sick. I was feeling very sick. And I expected him to help me get up off the floor, but he didn't. He just sat in the corner and watched. And I waited for him to come help me get up, but he didn't. He just watched. And eventually, I got up, I got myself to the sink, I washed my face. He wanted to see if I could do it, because I was leaving for Israel for the rest of my life. And like Moses, who watched his people enter the land of Israel, he wanted to watch me go and see how I would fare. And he had faith. I'm grateful for every time someone compliments my integrity. That's him. I will always be my Zeta's little girl, his heart and his light. Even after he went fully blind, he would say I was the most beautiful in the room, and I would say, how do you know? You can't see. He said, I know. I still know. He will always be my moral compass, because he wasn't just standing in. He was my father and will always be my father, now in heaven. No matter where I am, I'm his little girl sitting up on his shoulders, quietly watching him do work. I'm able to see so much more and do more and help those I can, because he raised me and he raised me up. And I promise because of him, I will try never to miss a spot.
I'd like to ask everyone to rise for the memorial prayer. El male rachamim, shochen bamromim, aמצי menucha nechona, tachat kanfei השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמת אברהם בן יוסף ורוחמה שהלך לעולמו בעבור שבלי נדר ייתנו צדקה בעד הזכרת נשמתו בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור החיים את נשמתו, אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר אמן. Please be seated. Just a couple of announcements. We're about ready to leave for the burial, which will take place at the Shaare Zedek Cemetery across from West Kildonan Park. First, the pallbearers will come forward and they will leave first, and then the family will follow, and then the rest of us will follow. Shiva will be observed at the house of Albert Rosenberg, 1384 Mathers Bay East. Sunday morning will be the first prayer at 9 a.m. Shacharit, at 9 a.m. in the morning. The rest of the week, Monday through Thursday, Shacharit, the morning service, will be at 7 a.m. Once again, 1384 Mathers Bay East. And Mincha and Mariv will be observed every evening from Sunday to Wednesday night at 7:30 in the evening. Once again, 1384 Mathers Bay East. Also, immediately after the burial today will be the meal of condolences, which will take place at the home of Albert Rosenberg, 1384 Mathers Bay East. I'd like to ask the pallbearers to now come forward. They will leave first, then the family, then the rest of the congregation.